Would you pray with me, please? Most holy and loving God, we thank you that as we enter this space, so do you. That you enter it within us, that you enter it between us, that you fill in the empty spaces, and that you stir in each and every part of us. We ask tonight that you touch us so that we might receive a word from you. Be with us this night, we pray in your holy name. Amen. So of course, this evening, or today, is Fellowship Sunday, which is now called Anniversary Sunday. And it's now 47 years since Troy held that very first service for MCC back in 1968. And gosh, I've been with MCC now for 25 years. Although I do think Robert beats us all here. You've been with MCC about
34.
34 years? I was going to say the first MCC started in London in 72. So that's quite a while back, yeah. And there's a lot happened since then. And I want to talk a little bit about that later, but today is also the feast day of St. Francis. And normally, I don't celebrate feast days, but St. Francis happens to be one of my heroes, and I want to kind of explain why. And first of all, there's a number of kind of legends and stories that abound about Francis. And the most famous one is called Francis and the Wolf. And the story goes like this, that Francis visits a town called Gubbio. And Gubbio is being terrorized by a wolf. And this huge wolf lives in the forest. And it started out by killing livestock, but it's now killed a couple of villagers. So they really are stumped as to what to do and how to handle this enormous animal. And Francis says, you know what? I'll go into the forest and I'll go and talk to it. And they're like, no, you can't, it'll eat you. And he's like, no, I'll go. So he takes a friar with him who's terrified and a couple of villagers, and they walk into the forest. And as they walk in, the villagers kind of lapse further and further behind until eventually it's just kind of Francis and the friar that are in front. And they walk into this clearing, and on the other side of the clearing is the wolf. And the wolf sees them. And immediately it bares its teeth and snarls and rushes towards them. At which point, Francis raises his hand and says, in the name of Jesus, stop. And the wolf just stops dead in his tracks. And Francis says, Brother Wolf, peace be with you. Sit. And the wolf sits like a common garden, household dog. And Francis says, look, we need to talk, because I know that it's in your nature to kill the creatures of the forest, but you've killed livestock, which the local townspeople are dependent on, and you've killed some people who are made in the image of God. This is not good. Now, I want you to promise that you won't kill any more livestock and that you won't kill any more people, and in return, I'll get the village to promise that they won't hunt you and kill you. And the wolf looks all kind of contrite and kind of nods its head, and Francis says, do you vow? And puts his hand out, and the wolf puts its paw out, puts it in his hand, and they're just astounded. So at that point, Francis says, come, let's go to the village. So they walk into the village, and the wolf's by his side like a pet. And again, of course, the people are terrified. No, here's the wolf. And they lock themselves away, and Francis says, no, come out. So they come out, and they see Francis there with the wolf that sat there calmly. And Francis says, look, I want you to promise that you won't hunt the wolf, that you'll leave the wolf alone. And in return, the wolf promises not to hunt your livestock and not to kill people. And he says to the wolf, do you abide by this? Will you agree to this? And the wolf kind of nods, and he puts his hand out, and the wolf puts his paw in his hand, and the villagers are kind of awed, like, wow, look at this. So effectively, Francis manages to broker this peace between the wolf and the villagers, and the legend goes that every day the wolf would go into the town and go around the houses and collect food, and actually the villagers felt safe knowing that the wolf was out there protecting the town. And when 2 years later the wolf died, they all went into mourning. That's one of the stories about Francis. So, do you think that it's true? Now, actually, I don't think that it's factual, but I do think that it's true. Let me explain why. Francis was born into a world that was rapidly changing. I mean, you'd think that we live in a changing world now. When Francis was born, which was at the end of the 12th century, the late 1100s, the world was changing majorly. See, up until that point, around Europe, most of Europe had been run by nobility who were placed in their positions by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and everyone else was a serf, a servant. And effectively, barter was the main way that people traded. And this was being replaced because suddenly you had these merchants who were rising up and creating this middle class, which was completely unheard of. And they were moving from a barter system to a money-based system, which again was completely new. And so you had this tension again between the nobility who'd been placed in their positions by the Pope and this rising middle class who worked really, really hard for what they had and for their positions and for their money. So there's this tension going on. And of course you've got two main powers. You've got the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Church, which is led by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and he kind of leads, if you like, the Christian world. And then on the other side, you've got Islam, which has been rising for the last couple of hundred years. And they're both at war. You've got the beginning of the Crusades. Sorry, you've got the middle of the Crusades. And in fact, during Francis's lifetime, Jerusalem falls to Islam, and all the Christians get slaughtered or thrown out. And so it's a rapidly changing world. And we kind of think that in those days there was just the Roman Church and that was all there was. Well, that's not true. There were lots of different religious groups scattered around. They just didn't have the political power that the church in Rome had. Now, one of these groups was a group called the Cathars. And the Cathars were really interesting because they called themselves Christian, but some of their beliefs were quite different. So, for example, they believed in reincarnation. They believed in equality between men and women. They believed that sex was good. They believed in contraception. And in fact, sex was supposed to be for fun. And the only time sex was bad was that if you produced a child who was unwanted and unloved. Producing somebody unwanted and unloved was a sin. But sex itself was fun, and that was good. They approved of same-sex relationships. And in fact, because the kind of Cathar system was first born in Bulgaria, they were called Bulgars, which is where you get the word bugger from. Bet you didn't think you'd learn that in church. Also at the same time, so you had these groups, especially around northern France. And beside this, you also had a guy called Pietro Waldo, or Peter Waldo. And he was a very rich cloth merchant in France. And he did the unthinkable thing, which is he translated the Bible from Latin into French. Now this is 300 years before the printing press. So, this is all done by hand. And then he has copies made, and he then encourages lay people to take on lay missions and to go out with the Bible and preach. So you can imagine the Roman Church hated him, and they hated the Cathars. But these are the groups that exist in Europe, and there were many, many more. So, at the same time, you've got a guy called Pietro Bernardoni, and he owns a store in one of the Italian cities called Assisi, And he spends a lot of time in France buying cloth. So he goes around all these cloth makers. And because Peter Waldo, who's the guy who's sending these people out preaching, is a cloth maker, a very rich cloth maker, then it's amongst cloth makers that his movement has become especially popular. And the movement is called the Poor in Spirit, but most people just call them Waldensians after Waldo. So you've got Pietro Bernardoni, who's moving around France, meeting these people, hearing these stories, who's finding out about this. You also have troubadours that have started to move around Europe. And the troubadours have got their own instruments, and they're singing songs about romantic love and about chivalry. And these are really radical new concepts. I mean, seriously, we wouldn't think so now, but back then, they were really radical concepts. So anyway, Pietro Bernardoni meets a French girl, takes her back to Assisi, marries her, and they have a son. In 1181, the son is born, and he is called Giovanni Pietro Bernardoni, or John Peter Bernardoni. Now, like most kids, John was given a nickname. And because his mother was French, and because his dad spoke French and did a lot of work in France, collecting all the cloth that he wanted for his business, he got nicknamed Frenchy. And the word Frenchy in Italian is Francis. So he got called Francis. And then later on, people knew him as Francis from Assisi, or Francis of Assisi, which is where he gets his name from. And he grows up this kind of troubadour figure. And he's a real hedonist. I mean, he loves the wine, the women, the song. His father's quite wealthy, so he can have what he wants, he can do what he wants. And he kind of explores the world. So he learns about the Cathars and the Waldensians, and he learns all of this stuff in a world that's changing really rapidly. Well, when Francis is 18, which is in 1199, there's a civil war in Assisi. The Pope is kind of focusing his attention very much on what's happening in the Middle East, because they've just lost Jerusalem. So the shop owners there, the middle class, realize that the Pope doesn't have the resources to send people to defend the nobility. So they rout them. And all the nobility get thrown out of Assisi and have to flee to Perugia, which is a papal state. So Francis is involved with this. And everything's well for a couple of years until 1202, Francis is 21, and war breaks out between Assisi and Perugia, because obviously the nobility want their place of power back in Assisi. The very first skirmish, Francis falls off his horse and gets taken prisoner, and he spends the next year as a prisoner in Perugia. Now, he becomes quite ill, so his father ransoms him, and he comes back to Assisi. Now, Francis is trying to work out what to do with his life. As I say, he's a bit of a hedonist, wine, women, song, the whole works. And he decides that, because now Assisi is a papal state, he decides that what he will do is that he'll go to the Crusades and he will fight on behalf of the Pope. Because if you do that, then you might get offered a princedom. So Francis decides that this is a good career move, this is the way forward, and his father, obviously proud that his son's going to go and fight in the Crusades, has this amazing suit of armour made for him that's all gold inlaid. It's a perfect fit. It's just the most expensive suit of armour. And they have a big party, a big send-off, and Francis goes off to the Crusades. Francis gets about 30 miles from home. He gets as far as Spoleto. And he has this vision of Jesus. And suddenly he realizes he can't go to the Crusades because he can't go around killing people just because they don't believe the same things that they believe. So he goes home and tells his father about this. And of course his father is absolutely furious because he's just spent a whole lot of money on this suit of armour that's now no good to anybody because it only fits Francis. Secondly, they all think Francis is a coward because basically he's like, hey, I'm off to the Crusades, and then 3 or 4 days later he's back going, no, I've changed my mind. So he's being branded as a coward, which doesn't bode well for the family, that doesn't look good for them. And then Francis takes it in his head that he wants to help the poor and the needy. So he does so, using his dad's money, which makes his dad even more upset. So after a while, Francis decides there's nothing for it, he will leave home. And he takes up residence. First of all, he decides that he will leave home and he will go to Rome on a pilgrimage where hopefully he will have some kind of a spiritual encounter. And the father pays for it, he's kind of glad to get rid of him. And he goes to Rome hoping for some kind of enlightenment, and in fact, all that happens is he gets mugged. So he comes home and he's all upset about being mugged and he doesn't know what to do next. And his father's like, get a life, do something with your life. And so eventually, Francis moves into this little cave locally where he spends a lot of time in meditation and he has some kind of spiritual encounters. His father thinks he's absolutely lost it. In fact, to the point where eventually he goes home one day for supplies and his father chains him up in the basement and doesn't let him out. And he ends up chained up in the basement for a month until his mother comes along and lets him out. So again, a little time goes by. Francis is now 24 and he's in this little church called a little church at San Damiano. And the little church kind of is in bad need of repair. But Francis is in there and he's praying before the crucifix. And suddenly he hears Jesus say, "Francis, repair my church." So Francis looks around and thinks, must mean this one. So he goes home, father's not in, so he finds whatever money he can find, and he finds some bales of cloth. He goes and sells those so that he will have the money to repair this church in San Damiano. Father comes back, realizes that all the money's gone, realizes that the cloth's been nicked as well, gets a hold of the local bishop and says, "Look, I've had enough. My son has now just ripped me off completely. He's stolen all his cloth, he's taken all the money. I want it all back, and I want him to deny his inheritance." And he gets dragged before this court, because in those days the court is before the bishop and the people of the town, at which point Pietro, which is Francis's father, says, "I've had enough of this, I want all my money back, and I want you to renounce your inheritance." And Francis just loses it and says, "Look, you can have it all back," and in a fit of temper takes all his clothes off and says to his father, "There you go, that's everything." At which point the bishop makes him a ward of the church and gives him a cloak so that he has something to wear. Now you'd think that at this point Francis would be ready to start, the Franciscan order, that he'd wander out into the snow now and start the Franciscan movement. In reality, he doesn't. What happens is, with nothing but a cloak on, he goes out into the snow and he gets mugged again and somebody steals his cloak. So he has absolutely nothing. In fact, he ends up naked at the local Benedictine monastery where he washes dishes for the winter. Now, he can't decide what to do after that, but he hears that there's this little town called Gubbio. And Gubbio has a problem in that just outside town there's a big leper colony. And the people in the town treat the lepers with absolute disdain. In fact, there's a lot of fear and a lot of tension. And Francis decides to go and support the leper colony. So in the spring, he goes out to Gubbio and he connects with the lepers. And after working with the lepers, and don't forget, in this time, around the early 1200s, to be a leper was to be cursed by God, so nobody wanted anything to do with you. And what Francis did was he went into the local town and said, "It's not true. The people who are lepers are your brothers and sisters, and they deserve as much care and attention as anybody else." And he forges this relationship between the townspeople and the leper colony until they get to the point where the townspeople are feeding and supporting the lepers who are then working on behalf of the townspeople. It's not a wolf. It's a leper colony. And what he does is he manages to broker this peace deal between the two. The story's true. It's just that when you say lepers, it doesn't sound as exciting as when you say wolf. So that's the way we have the story. But the reality is that what Francis does is absolutely revolutionary, because he teaches that people who are lepers are as much our brothers and sisters as anyone else. He teaches that all the animals are our brothers and sisters as much as anyone else, that all life is sacred. And this is absolutely new and unique in terms of the Christian church. And Francis is this amazing character in that he's much more human than the story of Francis and the wolf would lead you to believe. And there is so much more that I could share with you about Francis. I mean, the stuff around creation being holy is really quite radical. Today's reading was the Canticle of the Sun that was written by Francis when he was 43 years old. And at this point in his life, at 43, he is both deaf and blind. And he dies at age 44 from cancer. So, not a long life. He dies in his early 40s. And St. Francis refused to speak badly of anyone. In fact, at one point, very audaciously, he decides he'd like to go and visit the Sultan to talk about the war that's going on over Jerusalem. So what he does is he crosses enemy lines, goodness knows how he does it, he crosses enemy lines, and he goes to see the Sultan. And miraculously, the Sultan sees him, and they actually forge this relationship, and the Sultan shows him around Jerusalem. He's the only Christian to get shown around Jerusalem throughout the occupation, because Francis refused to speak against somebody else simply because their religion was different, simply because they believed differently. This is radical, the stuff that he does. When young women wanted to join the Order of St. Francis, and women didn't join male orders, but Francis allowed it. In fact, when a young girl called Claire, who was 16 years old, came to him and said, look, I want to join, he set her up in the church in San Damiano, at the church that he'd rebuilt, and she became the abbess there. In fact, she was made a saint 2 years before she died. It's just this extraordinary life that Francis leads, and that's why he's one of my heroes, because for me, he's such an ordinary person who just does extraordinary things. I used to love it when Troy Perry used to write to the churches. And whenever he used to write to the churches, he would always start his letters with the words, "My dear saints." And for me, it showed that he understood. Because the stories of the saints, even the stories in the Bible, are wonderful, but behind them are real people just like you and me, living really messy lives just like you and me, getting it wrong most of the time, just like you and me. Troy held the first MCC service in 1968, 47 years ago, and it's not been an easy journey. First of all, Troy started MCC because, first of all, his partner left him and he had nothing to live for, so he tried to commit suicide. And when he woke up in the hospital with bandaged wrists, a woman came along and said, somebody loves you. And suddenly he turned his mind around. And then a few weeks later, he ended up in a gay bar. And in those days, of course, the police would just swoop in and just arrest a whole load of people just because they could, because it was illegal to be gay. So the police swept in, arrested a whole load of people. One of them was Troy with his friend. They ended up in jail overnight. And the friend said, you know, just nobody cares about us. And Troy said, well, God cares. At which point the friend said, you've got to be joking. I mean, seriously. And at that point, Troy thought, you know what? If nobody else, if no other church will open its doors to people who are LGBT, then we'll start one. And started with a dozen people in LA in 1968. And again, it's not been an easy journey. Did you know that at one point, Troy was thrown out of MCC by the board for being too gay? They didn't like the fact that Troy was on the streets marching for gay rights. Their opinion was that religion and politics shouldn't be mixed. Now, what happened was his church members voted him back in again quite quickly, but they actually threw Troy out of MCC for campaigning for gay rights. I mean, now we look back and we think, good heavens. But you know, some of the stuff that we had to deal with, churches threatened and firebombed. The HIV virus, of course, took a terrible toll. So many good people and wonderful leaders lost in the early days. And then MCC is such a diverse group of churches, from evangelical Pentecostal on the one hand to kind of high church and smells and bells on the other hand. I have a feeling that trying to pastor MCC as a denomination must be like trying to herd cats, because we're just so completely different. You have to hold the most extraordinary paradox in your hand in order to be able to pastor a denomination. It's not easy. But in fact, it's not easy for anyone. It never is. It's never a smooth ride. The stories that we hear sometimes sound simple and they sound inspiring, but behind each story is a messy, complicated human. And Francis was right. We are all human. We are all sacred. We are all messy and complicated and fallible and human and holy. The church we serve is holy. The world we live in is holy. The animals we love and care for are holy. Creation is holy. Because if it's made by a holy God, how can it be anything but holy? On this anniversary Sunday, we remember that we are all saints, whatever our stories. Amen.